It is so good to be here with you tonight. It's a cold, windy, and rainy evening, and yet it's warm in here. And it's warm both in terms of the comfort of this place, but also the spirit that I feel among you. So thank you for having me, and Dr. Kai, thank you for inviting me to be here. Dr. Kai and I have met as our seminaries, the Zomi Christian Theological Seminary and the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, have begun conversations about how we might work together to train ministers for ministry in the days ahead. And it's such important work, and we are filled with joy that we have been introduced to one another, and we look forward to what the future is going to bring as we work together. The scripture passage that I want to preach from tonight is from John chapter 6, and it's the first 14 verses. Listen again to this familiar story from scripture. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now, the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people? Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now, there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 of them in all. And then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." I'm old. My wife and I, Regina, we met in college in 1979. Now, looking around the room, there's not many here who remember 1979, but I do. And in the summers in between semesters in college, she would return home to Wichita, Kansas. Now, the town where our college was located in Arkansas was over 400 miles from Wichita, Kansas. That's like 7.5-hour drive. So this was before the internet. I know that's hard to imagine. And back then, long-distance phone calls were expensive. You had to pay by the minute. So there was no FaceTime for us to use to stay in touch, and we weren't really in a situation where we could afford to call long distance, so we did this thing called writing letters. You know, where you take a piece of paper and you write a letter and send it in the mail. Well, one summer, I had managed to save up enough money to buy an engagement ring. So, excited and nervous, I arranged a visit with Regina at her home in Wichita, Kansas. And that's where I planned to spring the question. So, after a romantic dinner out and a movie, it was the opening night for Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. not a very romantic movie. But anyway, she said yes, and a new chapter in our lives began. Well, as I drove home that 7.5-hour drive, I was mostly excited and elated. I say mostly because I realized that I had miscalculated the amount of money I needed to buy gas for the trip home, and that I was going to run short. Now, at the time, I was driving an exciting Dijon mustard-colored 1977 Toyota Corolla, and it got terrific gas mileage. But about 3 hours from home, I knew I was going to run out of gas. Now, in those days, I had no credit card, and so I stopped at a service station, and I found the manager. And I explained my situation, that I had not planned well, and I had several hours left to go, and I didn't have any money. And for whatever reason, she gave me a stern look, and she handed me a $5 bill, which, by the way, back then would buy a lot of gas, but that's beside the point. I took her card so that I could mail her the money when I returned home, and I did. But if she had not loaned me that $5, I might not have made it home. I don't know how I would have made it home. It never feels good to not have enough, does it? To feel like we're going to run out. To feel like that whatever we have is not going to make it. It's not going to meet the need. In this case, not having enough would have meant me probably being stranded on the side of the road. But there have been other times when I did not have enough. When I didn't have enough attention to notice someone else in need. When I didn't have enough imagination to see a solution to a problem. When I didn't have enough grace or patience for someone in front of me. Today's text is a familiar one. It's the feeding of the 5,000. We've heard it before. Jesus is traveling near the Sea of Galilee, and the stories of him healing the sick have spread far and wide, and a large crowd has gathered. They've gathered to see Jesus. Now, I don't know if the crowd wanted to just hear him teach, or they wanted to see him do more healings, or maybe they just wanted to say, I got to see this one we've been hearing about. But whatever their reason for being there, Jesus saw them. Jesus saw the crowd. Now, if I saw a big crowd of 5,000 gathering around me, I probably would head off in the other direction out of fear. Or if I was in a fundraising mood, I might try to raise some money for my seminary. But Jesus is not like that. Jesus first thinks of their need, and in this case, their need to be fed. He turns to Philip and he says, where are we going to buy food for all of these people? And Philip, being a sensible person, he knew that buying food for this many people the cost would be extremely high, and there was just no way that they had the funds among them to do that. So he does what we would probably do, and he turns to Jesus and tries to explain it to him. He says, now, Jesus, more than a half year's salary worth of food wouldn't be enough for each person to have even a little bit. So clearly, there's not enough. There's just not enough. The disciples could have gathered all the funds they had between them, put them together, and it still wouldn't have been nearly enough to feed this crowd. Well, Andrew discovered a child who had planned ahead and brought some food with him. And he told Jesus, he says, a youth here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that for a crowd like this? What good is that for a crowd like this? What he was saying is, this is what we have. 5 barley loaves and 2 fish brought by a youth. What good is that? This is what I have. What good is that? And if we think about it, it's a question you and I may find ourselves asking as we go through life. We see the need. We see the needs around us. We see the problems of this world. We see the crowds of this world. We see the wars. We see the hunger. We see the grief and the loss. We see sickness and illness. We see meanness. We see cruelty. And we say, God, this is all I've got. What good is this in the face of all of that? That's the question that Andrew was asking, and it's the question that I find myself asking. We look at what we have. We see how small it is. We look at the world's problems and we wonder, how is this possibly going to make a difference at all? But Jesus takes the boy's bread, doesn't he? He blesses it, he breaks it, and there is enough. He breaks it, he blesses it, they distribute it, and it is enough. It's enough to feed those who were sitting really close. It's enough to feed those that were sitting further out. It was enough to feed everyone there. And he did the same with the fish. I love this part. He says, he blesses the fish, and there is enough that everyone had all the fish they wanted. Now, I grew up, as I've already said, in Arkansas. And in Arkansas, fish fries are a big thing. We have big ponds and lakes, and there's catfish everywhere, and we can do a fish fry. But there's one thing that seldom happens at a fish fry, and that is that everybody eats all they want. Typically, there's not quite enough fish for that, and I can eat a lot of fish. But it tells us here that Jesus did the same with the fish. He blesses it, and there is enough for everyone. So much fish and bread, in fact, that whenever they were done, the disciples went around and collected 12 baskets of leftovers. 12 baskets of leftovers. I've wondered about that. I've wondered what happened to those baskets of leftovers. Did the crowd get to-go boxes that they could take home? Did they take those to nearby villages or towns and share them? I don't know what happened with the leftovers, but what I do know is that not only was there enough, but there was enough to share. Enough to share. Friends, the world tells us a story. It's a story of scarcity. It's a story that there is not enough. And the world tells that to us all the time in so many different ways. We hear it. We hear it when we're told there's not enough shelter. So some people have to be homeless or live in substandard housing. We're told we can't grow or distribute enough food, so some people have to be hungry. We're told there's not enough friendship in the world, so some people have to be lonely. We're told there is not enough love to go around, so some people are hated or feared or discarded or shunned. We're told there's not enough ideas, that we are stuck with the way things have always been. The world tells us this story of scarcity, tells us there's not enough. And if we believe that there's not enough, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do what it takes to get ours. We're going to do what it means to get the part that belongs to us. We're going to hoard. We're going to compete with each other. We're going to look out for ourselves because there's not enough. But I am here to tell you, and I think if we read this passage of Scripture and we listen to it, that it tells us that God is telling us an entirely different story. That God is saying what the world says about there not being enough is not true. There is enough. There is enough. In fact, there's even enough for sharing. Now, there's not enough for the greedy, never is. But there's enough for a good life, enough for health for all of us, enough for happiness, enough for peace. But if we listen to God's story of plenty as opposed to the world's story of scarcity, we will also treat each other differently. We will hoard less. We will give more. We will notice the needs of others. We will care for others. Our God, friends, is a God of plenty, a generous God who shares freely. We see it again and again in Scripture. Remember, we saw it with the quail and the manna provided to the Hebrews in the wilderness as they journeyed toward the promised land. There was plenty. We saw it in the overflowing wine that Jesus provided at the wedding at Canaan. We see it in the abundance of fish in the nets of the disciples when Jesus told them to cast beside the boat. We see it in the feeding of the 5,000. We see it over and over in Scripture that God says there is enough. I was visiting at the First Baptist Church of Corbin, Kentucky, which is down in southeastern Kentucky on the way down to Tennessee. And it happened to be a Sunday morning when they were having the Lord's Supper. And, I grew up in church, so I've seen the Lord's Supper done all through my life. And I'm used to it. I knew what to expect. But in this instance, they kind of threw me a curveball because they had two tables set up. They had one table set up with bread, with loaves of bread on it. I'm used to seeing a table set up with a loaf of bread. The minister breaks it, we pass it. No, this was a table that had a mountain of bread on it. It had loaves and loaves and loaves stacked on the table, so many that I was just sure it was going to fall and crumble and they would spill out. And I thought, this is ridiculous. There's no way this crowd's going to eat all that bread. And then on the other table, they had all these cups and chalices and pitchers, and it was also just covered up in all of the cups. And then it dawned on me that what this church was saying in the way they had set the tables for the Lord's Supper, for communion, that the way they had set this up was to send a message. And it's the same message that we've been talking about from this passage, that with God, there's not just enough, there's enough to share. There's plenty. There is abundance. It's an image that has stuck with me. And every time I think about and participate in the Lord's Supper, I now remember that image and this sense of overflowing abundance that is part of God's work among us. May God forgive us when we believe there is not enough. Whenever we believe that we look at what we have and we say, what can this possibly do? When God can take that little bit and do amazing, amazing things with it. So when we feel like it's not enough, when there's just not enough, when we don't seem to have enough hope, enough energy, enough love, enough forgiveness, enough joy, remember that God is not like us. God is not like us. God has enough. God has enough to share. And friends, the reason we're here is God has shared with us. The pastor and theologian Nadia Bolz-Weber wrote about this, and she said it like this. She said, I wonder if, like the disciples, we too make the mistake of not always realizing how different God is from us. And what a good thing that is. That we have a God who can actually feed so many on so little. A God who created the universe out of nothing. That can put flesh on dry bones, nothing. That can put life in a dry womb of nothing. Nothing is God's favorite material to work with. Perhaps God looks upon that which we dismiss as nothing, as too little, as insignificant, as worthless. and says, ha, now that is something I can work with. Friends, we worship a God of plenty. Rejoice and live generously. Will you have a prayer with me? Oh God, remind us that we are entering a world that believes in scarcity. Help us to see the abundance you have provided and give us the grace and the courage to share with a world that so deeply needs your touch. Amen.